on whom that TV series was really based and inspired.
How deep cover are we talking about here? Are we talking about, in any of these cases, spies planted here undercover and deep cover by the Soviet Union, who woke up one day and read the paper and said, oh, well, seems like things have changed back in Moscow, who then wondered what to do next?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's amazing is some of these spies were sent out deep in the Cold War, and they were sent out in the 80s to start building their cover. And then, the Soviet Union disappeared, and they had to make a decision. Now, supposedly some actually kind of gave up, but the ones I've been looking at and I write about in this book decided they'd keep going. They basically transferred their allegiance from the Soviet Union to Russia, and they kept going with their mission. And it is amazing because some of them spent effectively more than 2 decades undercover, pretending to be someone else but a different nationality, trying to get deep into American society to be able to meet people and basically target people for reasons of espionage.
Were the missions the same? In other words, once, let's say, the surviving KGB apparatus under its new set of initials in Russia now, not the Soviet Union, once they reestablished contact with all of these people and said, okay, you're still deep undercover, did they change the mission at all, or was it still just an antagonistic mission of acquiring information that they weren't supposed to have?
In a sense, it never changed. I mean, they would get sometimes different tasks and say, well, a new administration has come in Washington. Can you find out what their priorities are on this or that? So there'd be sometimes specific taskings they would get, which would be different. But the fundamental mission was always the same, which is get deep into American society, find people with influence, find people who might have access to sensitive information or secrets, get close to them and send information about them back to Moscow. Often these illegals weren't actually doing the final bit, which is then to try and pitch, to try and recruit to those people, but they were targeting, trying to understand them and get close to them so that potentially Moscow could then approach them to try and use them as intelligence assets.
Gordon Carrera, by the way, is the only journalist to have interviewed serving heads of both the CIA and Britain's MI6. Compare the two organizations today, if you would.
CIA is much larger, and it's also, they are slightly different because the CIA has different functions. So the CIA also has a kind of analytic capability, whereas MI6 really just does the intelligence gathering. It doesn't, interesting enough, it doesn't kind of analyze it or process it in the same way. It really just focuses on recruiting sources, recruiting agents overseas. And it's much smaller, MI6. Sometimes that size is a disadvantage. Sometimes it can be an advantage because it can be a bit more nimble. But they work closely together. They share a lot, not everything, but quite a lot together and work pretty closely with each other. But still some differences in how they go about things, certainly.
I've heard it said of the United States, and I'm curious if this is at all accurate or just an oversimplification, that our intelligence efforts are a little too high-tech obsessed. That is to say, we're thrilled when we can read a license plate from orbit, but we're not that good in what's known as HUMINT, that is to say HUMINT, human intelligence. Any truth to that? Well,
I think there's half a truth to that, in that I think the U.S. is very good and very focused on technical intelligence, isn't it, the lead of it, whether it's satellites or eavesdropping or other forms of technical intelligence gathering, and certainly it focuses more on that and has the resources to focus more on that than other countries. And so I think maybe the UK then feels its strength and what it can bring is focusing more on that human intelligence, on finding agents. But I still think the US is certainly capable of that. And actually, in the book I've written, one of the central stories is that the US, actually the FBI, working with the CIA, was able to recruit a human intelligence source inside the Russian intelligence service, who was able to provide for a decade intelligence on those deep cover illegals living in the United States. And that was why they were able to be breaking into that apartment. That's because they knew where they were. That meant they knew who they might be approaching or trying to understand. So it gave them that insight, because in that case, the U.S. certainly was successful in recruiting an agent right at the heart of Russian intelligence.
More to come with our guest, Gordon Carrera. He is the security correspondent for the BBC and also the author of Russians Among Us, published by William Morrow. 1-866-50-JIMBO. Back in a moment. The Manchurian Candidate. Always a dramatic and intriguing possibility. In fact, there were at least 2 movies made on that particular theme. Gordon Carrera, our guest, security correspondent for the BBC. He has written a number of books, including Russians Among Us, Sleeper Cells, Ghost Stories, and The Hunt for Putin's Spies, published by William Morrow. As we go to a call here, you can't undertake a story like this without having certain preconceptions. You know the general subject area, and as you go into this particular book, this particular study, there are certain things that you expect to find. What were the biggest surprises that you found? A head slapper in which you wound up saying to yourself, wow, I never would have thought that.
You know what? It was some of the stuff which really struck me was some of the human stories almost about some of the people who were these deep cover spies in America. And I found particularly not so much their stories, but the fact that they had children, that these children were brought up in America thinking they were Americans when in fact they were the children of Russian spies. And they grew up just thinking they were normal American kids in the suburbs until one day in June 2010, the FBI turn up at their house and say, your parents have been arrested, and by the way, your parents are actually Russian. I mean, that to me is just extraordinary.
It is extraordinary, and yet if you stop and think about it, I suppose, given the delicacy of the situation, kids cannot necessarily be trusted with that kind of information.
That is absolutely right. And one of the dilemmas that, the FBI heard the parents talking about was, what do we do about our kids? If you tell them too young, the risk is, they'll suddenly blurt it out at school or something. But if you wait too late to tell them, what does it mean if they become Americans and their loyalty to is America? So actually, there was this kind of tension and this really complicated dilemma for these deep cover spies about, what do you tell your children, and how do you deal with that? So it was actually kind of little details like that I just thought were fascinating.
Were these real couples? In other words, were they actually married and presumably in love, or were they agents who simply were told to go about the business of pretending to being married, including procreating?
Good question. So in the past, it looked like often people were put together and they were told, we're going to send you out, and by the way, here's someone who's going to be your wife because they'll act as your support officer. But also, certainly in some of the cases I looked at, they were genuine couples, actually. And in one case, certainly, they were recruited as a couple in university in Russia who were going out, and they were spotted and talent spotted and thought of, you two could work as a couple, and then sent out together. So strangely, they married once in Russia, and then they went to Canada and kind of pretended to meet again as a couple, and pretended to meet for the first time, and then got married a second time when they were out there. So the strange things people do.
Oh, what a tangled web we weave. Here's Nelson in Reading, Pennsylvania, on the Jim Bohannon Show with Gordon Carrera, the author of Russians Among Us. Hello, Nelson.
Hi. Gordon, this sort of piggybacks off of Doc's earlier question. You had mentioned some of the issues that had happened in England, the radioactive and the nerve agents and stuff. There didn't seem to be a lot of public pushback. There was some rhetoric and stuff, but overtly there wasn't very much done about that. Covertly, were there things being done behind the scenes that we don't know about, that you might know, that, or did Putin just sit there and say, hey, did another one, screw you guys?
You know what, that is a great question, because I think one of the problems was in 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, a Russian living in London who's a former Russian security officer, was killed by a radioactive poison. And while there was a bit of outrage, fundamentally nothing was done about it. I mean, very small sanctions were made and a couple of Russian diplomats were expelled. But in a sense, Putin must have thought, well, I got away with that. And I think that was a problem, that there was a failure to deter the Russians and to make them think there would be a cost to carrying out such an act. And so then you get to 2018, and they use nerve agent in Salisbury against another Russian defector or a person who'd come to live in the UK. And this time I think there was a tougher response, and I think they'd learned from previously. And one of the things that overtly was done was Russian intelligence officers working as serving undercover as diplomats were expelled in the UK and also in a number of other countries, including the US. And I think that did some damage to Russian intelligence operations. And I think certainly they will have tried behind the scenes to disrupt them even further, to kind of mess with them, to just disrupt the way they could operate. Now, has it been enough to really make Vladimir Putin think, I would never do that again? I'm less sure of that.
Yeah. One other thing, too, that I would note here, you indicate that pretty much the switch from Soviet spying to Russian spying, it didn't take very much time. There was an interim period there where we were, I think, a little unsure of just what our relationship would be with the new Russia. That would be the period under Boris Yeltsin. Did all of this continue under him? I mean, certainly once Putin came along, there's no question about it, but was there ever a period of what could be called genuine détente?
When it comes to spying, I don't think so. I think there were certainly groups on both sides who simply kept going through the 90s. Now, it's true that, under Yeltsin there were perhaps less resources for the spies. They were, to some extent, a bit in retreat until Putin came along and around 2000 kind of turbocharged them with more resources and more sense of purpose. But certainly even in that period in the 1990s, they still kept going. They still kept running agents. I mean, it's worth saying they had, through in the early 90s, they had, a top agent, Aldrich Ames, who was inside the CIA. And through that decade until 2001, they had another agent inside the FBI, Robert Hansen. So they were still running agents right in the heart of U.S. intelligence in that.
Follow up to that, did we ever have anybody comparable to Ames or Hansen that we controlled in the Kremlin?
I think there have been some, and I would say that the case I look at in this book of a guy called Alexander Patayev, who was in Directorate S, was a very important agent because he was there for 10 years, able to provide really high-grade intelligence about the deep cover illegals, not just in the U.S. but in other countries as well. So I think there have certainly been successful agents run on the other side as well, and that was also true in the Cold War as well. So there's definitely been a kind of back and forth there. It's hard to score it, if you like, and say quite who had the upper hand at different sides at different points.
Yeah. Gordon Carrera, author of Russians Among Us. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, and we'll be back with more in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show on Her Majesty's Secret Service. All things spy-ish tonight, and of course we're talking about the real thing with BBC News security correspondent Gordon Carrera, the author of Russians Among Us. And let's take a call from Pat, who calls in from northern Michigan on the Jim Bohannon Show. And Pat, welcome.
Hi, Jimbo. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm thinking about all the way back to World War II when, because we all know that the Russian imperialism was bred in with the European imperialism all down through the decades. So they all worshiped Catholicism until the
Russians were never Catholic. The Russians were always Eastern Orthodox. I'm not even sure where we're going with this, but
it's a strain of the same.
Well, whatever.
Right?
I mean, let's get to the point here very quickly because I'm not sure there is one.
All right. Yeah, I'm trying, Jim. So my question is, especially with your guest being from England, with the assault with the Muslims and whatnot, I think the whole assault is on religion. Because Muhammad, if you could read the Quran back to the earliest statements, he would eat with Jews and Catholics.
All right, and which is an interesting topic we have explored before, and we must explore again one of these days. It's not really directly what we're talking about in this particular circumstance. So let me ask Gordon Carrera this. Where are we going now?